Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. William Kent Krueger won back to back Barry and Anthony Awards for Best First Novel when he and his signature character, Cork O'Connor, made their debut together in Iron Lake. He's been equally celebrated as the Edgar winner for Best Novel for Ordinary Grace, while This Tender Land took the New York Times bestseller chart by storm, staying there for a record 6 months as readers couldn't get enough. Krueger has remained equally popular over the past 25 years with his now mythic among fans Cork O'Connor series. Set against different backdrops throughout Minnesota over the course of nearly 20 books and counting with Boundary Waters, Purgatory Ridge, Blood Hollow, Mercy Falls, Copper River, Thunder Bay, Red Knife, Heaven's Keep, Vermilion Drift, Northwest Angel, Trickster's Point, Tamarack County, Wendigo Island, Manitou Canyon, Sulphur Springs, Desolation Mountain, Lightning Strike, Fox Creek, the river we remember, the levee, and Spirits Crossing. He joins us today from the land of 10,000 lakes to talk about it all. William, thank you so much for being here.
A pleasure.
Ordinary Grace really took the world by storm when it debuted in 2013 on the New York Times bestseller list, even winning the Edgar Award for Best Novel from the Mystery Writers of America. The story begins, however, years earlier in New Bremen, Minnesota in 1961, when Frank Drum was just 13, but it's told from the perspective of an early 50s Frank 40 years later. Why did you feel like this was the right lens to narrate the story through?
I tapped, one of the reasons that I wrote Ordinary Grace was I'd been looking for a story for a long time that would allow me to go back and recall an important period in my own life, the summer I was 13 years old. And I wanted to be able to go back and recall that time and evoke it in such a way that I could use my own memories, my own perceptions, my own emotions from that period of time to create this story. So Frank Drum behaves a whole lot and remembers a whole lot, just in the same way I did. The town of New Bremen is very similar to the small Midwestern towns where I spent my adolescence. The Drum family, the template for the Drum family was my own family. I pulled people from my own past, my own experience, and plop them right into that story. So there is a lot of who I am invested in Ordinary Grace. For me, creating the town of New Bremen and creating it sort of like the towns that I had grown up in, and creating characters sort of like those that I'd known, allowed me the freedom to use them in the story in the way that the story dictated. So I found it actually quite easy to pull from my own experience and translate those experiences, those emotions, those memories to the story itself.
You created an equally profound time and space that This Tender Land is set in. Please introduce viewers to each of the four lead characters, Odie O'Banion and his brother Albert O'Banion, and their best friends, Mose and Emily, as they came to life on the page individually for you, and then as an ensemble as the story they told together progressed.
Well, it helps to have a strong narrative voice to begin with. In both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, I had adolescent narrators, and and they sound a lot like I sound. And once I have that strong character for other characters to play off of, it's very easy for me to begin to see how they relate. And when I see how they relate, I begin to understand who this other character is. And they become, in the case of both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, the characters became really more fully realized the more I got into the story. With both of these stories, I didn't know where I was going when I began. I just knew kind of what I wanted to do. And as I wrote the stories and created the scenes in which the characters played parts, they really revealed themselves to me in important ways.
What about writing from the unique perspective of twins like Odie and Albert?
Well, let's start with Odie and his older brother, Albert. I told you that when I created Ordinary Grace, my family was the template. So in that story, the relationship between Frank Drum and his younger brother, Jake, great name, by the way, really reflects very much the relationship I had with my next older brother. I am the youngest of three boys, and I have a younger sister. We have a younger sister. So that reflects that relationship. For This tender land, I tapped my older brother, my oldest brother, for Albert. Albert really is patterned after my oldest brother, who, like Albert, was always the smartest kid in the room, and he let you know it. And my oldest brother, like Albert, always knew what I should be doing with my life. So it was easy for me to work with that relation. There's a deep, deep, deep love there. Occasionally resentments, as happens with every brother relation. Are you a brother? Deep love, but you can also butt heads. That's the way it goes. So
When we were
it was easy for me to write that particular relationship. And then as I created the family of the vagabonds, and they began to relate to one another in more and more significant ways, I could see that familial relationship growing there as well.
How does a story like this outline differently for you versus, say, if you're writing in the world of old Cork?
Yeah, it was a very organic process. When I write a story for my Cork O'Connor mysteries, those are all mysteries essentially. And as I often tell audiences, a mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else. And I think that the success of a mystery depends largely on the timing of the reveals, when you give the reader the clues that are necessary for the reader to solve the mystery at the heart of the story. So when I write a story in the Cork O'Connor series, I think that story through as completely as I can before I ever begin to put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, typically speaking, I know how the story begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why, I know the themes I want to weave through the story. But I wanted a different process with both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land. They were different kinds of books that came from a different place. I only knew a few essential elements of the story I was going to tell going into each of those. And I very much let the stories reveal themselves to me. I had no idea when I began where they were going to take me. I didn't always know all of the characters that were going to be involved. And I got to tell you, Jake, the writing of both of those stories were probably the most extraordinary experiences I've had as a storyteller.
Foundationally, what do you feel for your readers are a few of the traditional fundamental pillars of storytelling that need to be there for the book to hold up from page one through the end?
For me, there are a couple of absolute foundations. The first is sense of place. Um, I'm a kid who grew up in the Midwest, and although I've lived a lot of other places, I firmly believe that once the Midwest sets a hook in your heart, it'll always pull you back, and it certainly did for me. And so when I set out to write both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, I wanted them to have a profound Midwest influence in the sense of place. And once you do that, then it's easy for the reader, I believe, or I hope, for the reader then to see all of the action that takes place within that setting. And then the second foundation, of course, is character. Every good story really, it's not so much about what happens, it's about who it happens to. And so your second order of business is to make sure that you have created characters that readers can invest their hearts in, their emotions in, they can feel for. And then in every good story, and Scheherazade, oh, who were the 101 Arabian Nights? Was that Scheherazade? Yeah. Scheherazade taught us all that suspense is absolutely necessary in every good story. So as I create my stories, I think about what are the moments of suspense that I can use to make sure the reader is hooked and has to go forward in the story.
Let's go back to
Old-fashioned storytelling technique.
As with Ordinary Grace, the reaction among both readers and critics made This Tender Land a runaway hit right out of the gate, spending a year and a half on the New York Times bestseller list. That must have felt great to know that the book resonated so roundly with fans.
Oh, how would you imagine? It felt it was incredibly surprising and marvelously gratifying. When I sent the manuscript to my editor, I said, Peter, this is an old-fashioned story. There is nothing new. I used all of the tried and true techniques of a good storyteller. And maybe there's not a place in fiction, modern fiction, for a good old-fashioned story, but that's what I wanted to tell, and here it is. But I also told them I believed that a story like this could find a place in readers' hearts. And that's exactly what happened, Jake. I get so many emails from readers who tell me how much they love the Vagabonds and tell me their own stories of their own mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and maybe grandparents who lived through the Depression and rode the rails and all of those experiences that they're willing to share with me. I was so blown away with the reception that this Tinderland received.
Turning the page back to childhood, I understand that rather than wanting to be an astronaut or a cop, say, you already knew by the third grade that you wanted to be a writer when you grew up. After your parents and teacher recognized the talent in a short story, The Walking Dictionary, that you wrote when you were just 8 years old.
My father was a high school English teacher. And when I was a kid, he was always storming around the house ranting something like, nobody uses dictionaries enough. Nobody uses dictionaries enough. So in the third grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was in fact about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could toddle off into the world and go to the people that needed it. My third grade teacher went gaga over that story. My folks oohed and awed over that story. I can tell you honestly, Jake, I knew in the third grade I was destined to be a storyteller.
Who are any early authors that you just couldn't put down once you picked them up? I have to imagine with your father being an English teacher that there were all kinds of books lying around the house.
Yeah, do you remember in Ordinary Grace, Frank talks about the fact that his father bought a set called The Great Books of the Western World. My father bought The Great Books of the Western World with terrific hope that his kids would read them all. But, despite the fact that my father was a high school English teacher and encouraged us to read great literature, here's a story I like to tell audiences. I wasn't particularly judicious in my own choice of reading material, especially in my adolescence. That changed pretty dramatically the summer I was 12 years old. That would have been between my 6th and 7th grade year. I was a Boy Scout then, and I decided that summer it was time to get my reading merit badge. And I was living in a small town in Ohio at that point. And so I went to the librarian and I made the arrangements. And when the time came, I showed up to do my duty. This was long before they had computerized check-in and check-out. So do you remember that? Are you old enough to remember that little pocket thing that used to be glued inside the back cover of every book with a check-in out slip inside? So what they did was they put me to work date stamping the returned books. So they gave me this black ink pad and a changeable rubber date stamp. And so for the first hour I was there, it was sort of ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And after an hour of that, the librarian proceeded to walk my way and ask me a very librarian-esque question. She said, Kent, what do you like to read? Well, the honest to God truth, Jake, was that I like to read comic books, but I didn't want to tell her that. So I briefly considered lying to her, but there was that whole a scout is trustworthy thing going on. So I told her the truth. And without batting an eye, she said to me, have you ever read The Count of Monte Cristo? I walked out of the library that day with that great Dumas classic under my arm, and I came back a couple of weeks later and checked out The Three Musketeers. And when I'd read everything our little library had by Dumas, I asked her, what should I read next? And Jake, this wonderful librarian turned me on to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle and Jack London and Robert Louis Stevenson, all these guys who wrote these great stories that were perfect for capturing a boy's heart and a boy's imagination. So I began writing very early with an idea that I wanted in whatever I wrote to make sure they were adventure stories, as well as anything else. So if you look at particularly my Cork O'Connor series, you see that adventure thread woven all the way through those stories.
Those are definitely some of the greats. Now, you attended Stanford University and were actually part of the anti-war movement via student protests. Any professors back then who were particularly enlightening or made a significant impression on you while your writing style was developing?
I have to say, honestly, my first year of Stanford, my memories are dominated by two things. Getting drunk and high and getting kicked out. I honest to God don't really remember much about the classes or my professors.
Fair enough. Well, the classic saying goes that a writer needs to live a lifetime before they sit down to write their first book. And boy, did you, working as everything from a logger to a freelance journalist. Please take us back to that moment on that walk in life when you finally decided to sit down and begin earnest work on your first novel.
Well, there's a long lead up to that. I didn't publish my first novel, the first in the Cork O'Connor series, until I was 48 years old. But as you say, I was always writing. Um, when I was working construction, I had established a discipline back then of getting up in the morning about 5:30 and going to a coffee shop to write before I went to work so that I could, play at being a writer. Then when my wife and I moved to Minnesota and she entered law school here, I became the sole support of the family. So, I became the guy who had to keep a roof over her head and food on the table. And I still wanted to develop as a writer.
Now, we understand your office was the same booth every morning at a famous local diner in Minnesota.
But fortunately, we were living then a couple of blocks from a place called the St. Clair Broiler, this iconic cafe in St. Paul that opened its doors at 6 a.m. every morning, 7 days a week. So I pitched to my wife the idea. I said, honey, if you're willing to get the kids up and dressed and off to school first thing in the morning so that I can go to the broiler and write, I swear to you, when I come home at the end of the day, I'll be the best husband, the best father you can possibly imagine. She bought it. So there I was at 6 o'clock every morning at the door of the broiler with my pen and my notebook in hand, pen and notebook, because this was long before we had laptops. They let me in. I sat down. They poured me my coffee and opened my notebook. And from 6 until 7:15 every day, I wrote. At 7:15, I closed my notebook, paid for my coffee, and went out front because at 7:20, a bus would pick me up there and take me to the university where I was working. So I have established that discipline across the whole course of my life, and it became even more important to me then when I had children and a wife and responsibilities, and still wanted desperately to become a writer.
At what point, when you were sitting down writing away each morning, did Cork O'Connor first walk out of your imagination and onto the page before making his public debut in Iron Lake?
Well, I think Cork probably preceded the decision to create a series set up north. So here's where Cork came from. Swear to God, this is the truth. Long before I knew what I was going to write or really had any story idea in mind, I had an idea for a guy that I could write about. And in the very beginning, Jake, all I knew about this guy was that he was going to be the kind of man who was so resilient that no matter how far life pushed him down, he would always bob back to the surface, and his name would be Cork. Honestly, that's where it came from. Now, I told that to an audience not too long ago. Some smart ass in the audience said, why didn't you just call him Bob? So that's where Cork came from.
Why did it make sense out of curiosity for you to set the series in the northern Minnesota woods?
The decision then to create stories set in the North Country came as a result of something we began doing here, my wife and I, shortly after we moved to Minnesota. In the summer, we began doing what everybody in the Twin Cities does in the summer. We began vacationing up north in the great North Woods, that beautiful North Country. And when I discovered, well, there's a place up there called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, one of the most beautiful places on the face of the earth. And when I discovered that remarkable territory, I knew this is what I want to write about. As I told you, I knew I wanted to set my stories up north. And what's the first tenet they teach you in a writing class? Write what you know, right? Write what you know. Well, one of the things that I knew about was what it was like to live in a small town. So I knew I was going to create a small town that would be home to Cork. I'm a family man, so I knew Cork was going to be a family man. I've known Minnesota for a long time, so I knew that the essential Minnesota was going to be significant to the story. And after 40 years of living it, I thought, okay, I know about human nature. So this is going to be a story about people first and foremost. And it all came together then when I created Tamarack County, the fictional Tamarack County. Although there is a real Aurora in northern Minnesota, that's not my Aurora. My Aurora is a fictional creation that is an amalgam the elements of so many of the North Country towns that I have come to know and love. I wanted to create a place that people couldn't say it's Ely or it's Babbitt or it's Virginia, but that would feel authentic to anybody that knows the North Country. That's one of the purposes Cork serves, is to offer the reader an eye and an ear and a nose and sometimes even a tongue to experience the great North Country.
Why was it important for the history of the blended cultural makeup of the area to factor into the series so strongly? Even down to Cork's own mixed Irish Ojibwe heritage, for instance.
So I began spending as much time up north as possible and doing all of the research I could about the place. Came to a realization that you can't tell a true story set in the North Country without including the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, as an element of the work. And that's when I made the decision to weave the Ojibwe culture into my stories, and eventually the decision to make Cork a man of mixed heritage, part Irish American and part Ojibwe. That's how that whole thing developed.
Did you have a list going of possible first names before you settled on Cork? And was O'Connor based on, say, an old high school teacher or local acquaintance?
So if you're looking at somebody of mixed heritage in the North Country, they can be Ojibwe Finn, Ojibwe Swede, Ojibwe Italian, Ojibwe German, Ojibwe Russian, you name it, because there's such a huge melting pot of cultures up there. For a variety of reasons, I finally decided that Cork was going to be Ojibwe and Irish. And his name very naturally at that point became Corcoran O'Connor.
How many drafts did Iron Lake go through during this period, and when did you settle on its fantastic title?
When I sold the manuscript to my publisher, it was not called Iron Lake. It was called Wendigo, because the myth of the Wendigo runs significantly through the story. But my publisher didn't like that title. So they asked me to come up with another one, and I finally offered them Iron Lake, and we all liked it.
Do you remember still the moment when you were sitting in the diner and you said, you know what, this is done and ready to go out the door?
When I thought I had the manuscript in the best shape I could possibly get it, I approached a ton of agents. All of them said, no, thank you very much. Because it was, it was a story about a small town in northern Minnesota. Who the hell cares about a small town in Minnesota, or Indians, for God's sake? Although Tony Hilderman was doing a pretty good job of it at that point. But I finally was able to interest an agent in Chicago in taking a look at my manuscript. She sent it back to me and said, I'm not going to represent you. Your story's too long. It was 500 pages. But she said, if you'll cut it by 100 pages, I'll be happy to take a look at it. Again, that was like asking me to cut off my right arm, but if that's what it was going to take, that's what I was going to do. So I reeled it in, and over the course of the next year, I actually cut it by 120 pages. Jane accepted me as a client, and in November of that particular year, she sent it to 6 of the largest New York publishing houses with this very bold demand: do you want to publish Kent's novel? Give us an answer by Christmas. I don't know what you know about the publishing business in New York, Jake, but nothing happens at Christmas. I mean, they all leave the city and they go to the Poconos or the Berkshires of Florida, wherever they go for vacation, and publishing kind of grinds to a halt. So Christmas rolls around, we haven't heard anything. New Year's rolls around, we still haven't heard anything. I still remember this really bleak night in the middle of January. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. My wife's beside me trying to console me. I've got my head in my hands and I'm whining something like, nobody wants my book. Nobody wants my book. But I get a call from Jane the next day, or it might have been the day after that, saying, somebody wants your book. It was an offer from St. Martin's Press, a really fine mystery imprint. Jane explained it was a first author contract, not a lot of money, but somebody wanted my book. I said, wonderful, Jane, where do I sign? She said, you're not going to sign because I think you're going to get another offer. The next day we got an offer from Simon & Schuster, and it was a much better offer. And I said, well, great, Jane, where do we sign? And she said, you're not going to sign because I've called St. Martin's. I've told them about Simon & Schuster's offer. I think they'll make a counter offer. The next day we get a counter offer. St. Martin said, not only will we pay him more money for Iron Lake, we know he's at work on a second novel, we'll buy that one too. I went, oh, great, wonderful, Jane. Where do I sign? And Jane said, you're not going to sign because I've called Simon & Schuster, told them about St. Martin's offer. I think they'll make a counter offer. And the next day we got a 2-book counter offer that was so good we couldn't turn it down. So when any up and coming young writer asks me, is it worth having an agent? My answer is absolutely.
Talk about starting your career off with a bang, though. How blown away were you when this book not only became a breakout hit with readers, but I think it's fair to say swept the awards circuit when you took home the Anthony Award and Barry Award the same year for Best First Novel, along with the Minnesota Book Award and the Loft McKnight Fiction Award. And did you have time to enjoy it, or were you already really headlong into writing the second book by then?
That was that was like 25 years ago. And I wish I could tell you, I remember exactly what that felt like. Mostly what I remember was I was struggling with the second book, this other book that I had under contract. And I think a lot of authors would tell you the first book is easier because you've had so much time, you can craft it beautifully. But the second book, you're under contract, you've got a deadline to meet, and you're going, God, how did I do that first one? So mostly that's what I remember.
Did you travel personally to the Quetico Superior Wilderness in the course of writing the second book, Boundary Waters? And how excited were you to be back in the action with Cork again, even though he and the rest of the main characters this time are stranded in a blizzard? I assume you've been stuck up in a winter storm or two yourself living up in that notoriously cold part of the country, which I have to imagine must have been helpful source material to draw from in weaving the mystery that followed.
One of the things people told me about Iron Lake was how incredibly suspenseful it was, which pleased me. But, I think it was suspenseful by accident. I really didn't know what the hell I was doing as I was writing that book. And so with Boundary Waters, I wanted to explore the whole question of suspense. How do you create suspense? How do you sustain suspense? How long do you hold the reader in suspense before you give them that payoff? So it was mostly going to be an experiment for me. And I wanted then to do everything I could in the background of the story, the setting of the story, to create a profound sense of hardship, concern, worry, suspense. Isolating them in the boundary waters, throwing everything I could that the North Country can throw at you up there just seemed like a pretty good idea to me. And I got to tell you, it worked. I think Boundary Waters is a really good, suspenseful story. And I've always been pleased with it as a follow-up to the first book.
It must have given you a lot of pride as an author to be able to introduce readers around the world to so many beautiful parts of your home state of Minnesota and so many different cultures, especially the Native American tribes, that you continue to spotlight so effectively essential to the plots of both Purgatory Ridge and Blood Hollow. First with the Mini Shumasag, or grandfathers as it's known of the Anishinaabe tribe, spread over 200 acres of great white pines, and then on the Ojibwe Reservation in Blood Hollow.
Well, about that point in time, there was, in fact, a controversy occurring up in northern Minnesota over some sacred growth of pines that had not been cut in the initial. The North Country is just devastated by the logging industry. Very seldom are you going to find any old growth up there because all the great white pines and other trees were cut for the logging industry. But there was a controversy over a patch of a growth of sacred pines up there that the government was going to allow loggers into, and the native people didn't. And I thought, well, this is an interesting situation. And so often in my stories, if you were to look across the series, I have used conflicts that arise out of the interface of the white and Ojibwe cultures as part of the story. I've written about Indian gaming casinos and the effect that that's had both on the Ojibwe and the surrounding white population. I've written about the ongoing battle we have here in Minnesota over hunting and fishing treaty rights. So I do try to keep my ear to the ground. I talk to my friends in the Native community to see what might be an interesting thing to weave into the next story. Everything that I write about that occurs in the Boundary Waters area, I usually have a real place in mind, so I can visualize what it looks like as I'm giving the reader all of the sensual details of that place. Have you ever been to the Boundary Waters? Put it on your bucket list. Yeah, there are lots of places where you'll have a thread of water that runs through a place. And in this case, Blood Hollow, the creek that runs through Blood Hollow is a reddish hue. And the creek is called Blood Creek. And that's a very natural thing in the North Country because tannins, most streams will run through bog areas, and the bog areas feed in tannins, and it colors the water as it comes through, and so it can come out looking a very dark color. So that's very natural. And the areas it runs through, if you step out there and you're all alone, you can feel the sacredness of the place. It wasn't difficult for me at all to create Blood Hollow.
How well did you feel like you'd gotten to know Cork by then, especially in terms of his approach to investigating a case? And what are some of the personality features that, along with his former law enforcement training especially, make him good at that job?
A law enforcement officer who is in an area where everybody knows who you are, as opposed to, a cop in a big city where you can be an anonymous face often, is very different. You're right. Um, in my initial thinking, Cork was going to be the sheriff of this town. And then I thought, oh crap, I have to know a whole lot about law enforcement if I'm going to do that. Make sure he follows the rules, and the hell with that, because I really didn't know anything. I thought I'll make him a former sheriff. That way he can do whatever he wants to and get away with it. So I made him, for a variety of reasons, the former sheriff then. I created a backstory for him that would allow him to be the former sheriff of the fictional Tamarack County. But then I began talking to rural sheriffs, interviewed at least 2 sheriffs and a couple of sheriff's deputies just to get an idea of what it's like to do rural law enforcement. And they were extremely helpful to me in creating Cork and that whole milieu.
The Devil's Bed marked a standalone release of yours in the early 2000s that I have to imagine, against the booming popularity and demand for more of Cork, was an enjoyable escape from that world just within the moment of its writing.
Yeah, I wrote it because I was corked out. Um, I, I honestly had, I didn't have another idea for a Cork story. I was really a little tired of Cork at that point. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to write a thriller. Which is a very different, has a very different engine at work in a thriller than in a mystery, typically speaking. So I thought I'm going to write a thriller, and I ended up creating The Devil's Bed. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it immensely, but it was a thriller, and I really prefer mysteries. Because it wasn't a Cork O'Connor novel, it sold more poorly than any book I had put out before that, and mostly since. Even though I thought it was it was my kind of thriller. It was a very character-based thriller, and readers who read it just love it, and they keep asking, when are you going to bring Bo Thorson back? And yeah, so it was very refreshing. And it did exactly what I had hoped it would do, Jake. It refreshed me. I came back and I wrote after that Blood Hollow, which won my first, well, actually my second Anthony Award, but this one was for Best Novel.
You then won back-to-back Anthony Awards for Best Novel with Mercy Falls and Copper River. Wow, major achievements so young in the series. And well before the awards, when you sat down to begin writing both of these, in terms of the specific cases, a mutilated body staged at Mercy Falls, and then of course Cork hunting down a ring of child killers in Copper River. Could we use these to talk about how you craft the cases that O'Connor and his company are working to solve, booking it out?
Well, first of all, plot is the hardest thing for me to work with. I'm much more comfortable working with the narrative elements, character, sense of place, language, atmosphere, which is what lends the story its beauty, makes it human. But you have to have a good plot. The plot is the skeleton, and you have to have this solid set of bones on which to wrap all of that beautiful stuff. So I think a lot about plot. It's the one thing that keeps me up at night, but it only keeps me up at night usually before I begin the book, because I try to think the plot through as completely as I can before I put my fingers to the keyboard. I used to outline chapter by chapter, so I knew what each chapter was going to accomplish in moving the story forward. But I haven't done that in years, because once I thought the story through, I can keep it together in my head pretty well. So the plot really is the kickoff. Usually I know what's going to happen. Then the question is, why did it happen? And then who are the people involved, and what are their backgrounds that would bring them to play a part in what happens? So all of that usually occurs in my head before I ever actually put my fingers to the keyboard, or in the old days, put my pen to paper. And then when I know the places that are going to be important, I try to make sure that I've been there. Can visualize it. So for Copper River, for example, I took a couple of long trips to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan where the story is set, so I could write about it believably and talk to the people. And when I talked to the people there, before I began to write the story, they gave me a lot of ideas for things that I could incorporate in that story that would be unusual, unique to the Upper Peninsula.
The underground murder mine mystery involving the vanishings that plays out in Vermilion Drift is another great example of this talent in action. Did you personally simulate that mine environment yourself before putting Cork and Co. in the same spot?
I made arrangements. I was going to just take a regular old tour because they do tours in the Tower Sudan mine, and the head ranger there said, "William Kent Krueger? Oh, I'm going to take you on my own special mine tour." It's nice when somebody knows and appreciates your work. So I got my own specialized, individualized tour of the mine, and it was an extraordinary experience.
In Mercy Falls, without giving too much away, there's a sniper taking shots at Cork, wounding but not killing him, and then that plot line continues into the next book. And then in Trickster's Point, Cork becomes the actual suspect in the death of his friend, who's also the newly elected Minnesota governor, Juba Little. Why do you feel it's important for your readers to keep their beloved lead character in a certain amount of danger here, versus, say, taking it easy on him now and then?
You know, I love Tony Hillerman's work, but one of the things that I missed in Hillerman's work was putting Joe Leaphorn or Jim Chi in danger. I always liked it best when they had to, use their own resources to get themselves out of danger. And so I enjoy putting Cork in those situations. But here's the deal, Jake. You don't necessarily get a lot of distance when you put your protagonist in jeopardy, because the astute reader knows that you're going to pull his or her ass out of the fire. They've got to be there in the next story. So the real suspense, where I think you really get the payoff, is when you put someone that the protagonist cares about deeply in jeopardy. So you don't really get a lot of distance when you put your protagonist in danger. But if you put somebody that the protagonist cares deeply about in jeopardy, then the question is, will the hero or heroine be able to save this person in time? And if you've read my series, you know that that doesn't always happen. So you know that although Cork is going to be fine, anybody else that I put in jeopardy in that story might not make it to the end. And that's where the suspense comes in.
As you rounded out your first decade writing Quirk O'Connor on the page with Thunder Bay, Red Knife, and then Heaven's Keep, fans are treated to more best-selling thrillers here, set against the most exciting and wildly entertaining cast you touch on. Whether we're talking about Henry Malou, Cork's spiritual advisor in Thunder Bay, or the Red Boys in Red Knife, or Cork's wife Jo in Heaven's Keep, or of course his daughter Jenny in Northwest Angel. Looking back, who are a few of your favorite supporting cast characters to revisit book in and out?
Well, first and foremost was Henry Malou, the Ojibwe Mide, the healer. Jake, he's the closest thing I write to a stock character, the wise old medicine man. But I've done everything I can to make him a human character. Sure, he is wise, and he's compassionate, he's courageous, he's funny, but he also farts a lot. And I imagined him in Iron Lake, and then I began to really fully flesh him out in the stories that followed, as I began to really understand the true nature of Henry Malou and the important part he plays in almost every story in the series. Most often, the insights are going to come from Cork, but occasionally Henry Malou will offer his own to Cork, and Cork becomes more enlightened in terms of his own understanding of this place he loves. I don't want to give the book away for anyone who might not have hit that book in the series, but there is a book in which maybe the most important person in Cork's life doesn't make it to the end. When I initially wrote that manuscript, that character did. And then I read the story for the first time, finished the first draft and read the story for the first time as a whole to make sure that the beginning was right, that all of the arc of the story was good, and that the ending was right. Well, the ending wasn't right. It was the ending I wanted, but it wasn't the ending the story wanted. And any good storyteller has to understand that at some point a story takes on a life of its own, an energy of its own. And if you're a good storyteller, you have to step back and let that story go where it wants to go. I knew when I wrote the ending in which that character dies, that it was going to be difficult for readers to accept. I had no idea where it was going to leave me and Cork in the series, but it was the right ending. So yeah, I've been there. And I got lots and lots of angry emails. I have never been called a bastard so many times in my life. Well, you mentioned Red Knife, which is a story that I wanted to write about violence. Um, a couple of years before I wrote that book, there was a shooting at the high school on the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota that at that point in time was the worst school shooting we had ever experienced in this country. And got me to thinking about violence. And I came to the conclusion that as a culture, although we don't admit this, we pass violence down from one generation to the next as a cultural norm. And so I wanted to write about that. So that's one. Sulphur Springs is one of my all-time favorites. It doesn't take place in Minnesota. It takes place in southern Arizona along our border with Mexico, because I wanted to talk about the refugees that were and continue to stream across our border and how we respond to that. And not only was it an important issue for me to write about, the research for that book was just an absolute delight. So those are two of the most recent ones that I would point readers toward that are among my favorites.
Now, fans get to keep knowing this cast better and better in more recent volumes of the series, like Tamarack County, Wendigo Island, Manitou Canyon, and Sulphur Spring. Would you talk a bit more about what it's like to live with Cork and Company on the page over so many years over the last 2 decades? It must feel like a family without that sounding too cliche.
Well, the Cork O'Connor series, if you look at it, is really the story of the Cork O'Connor clan. All of Cork's family plays significant parts in the stories. Sometimes they take more center stage, sometimes they are supporting casts. But for example, in Wendigo Island, Jenny plays a significant role. In Tamarack County, it's Stephen who plays a significant role, as well as Annie does too in that story. And so when I'm writing his Cork's children, particularly, I begin to understand them better and better, because, across the course of the series, everybody has aged about 15 years at this point. So all of his children were much younger. Now they're adults and they have lives of their own and personalities of their own. And they are people separate from who they were when they were, Cork's little kids. And so I have to imagine them, dive deeply into how they see the world now, how they see themselves, how they see the relationship with each other and with their father. And that's always an enjoyable experience. One of the things that keeps it fun for me, and I hope keeps it interesting for readers, is the decision I made very early on to create a dynamic protagonist. So here's Mystery Writing 101. When you create a series with a central protagonist, you have only, I think, two choices in the kind of protagonist you're going to create. You can create a static protagonist, or you can create a dynamic protagonist. What's a static protagonist? Somebody who never changes, somebody who's the same story to story to story. Think Sherlock Holmes. You read one Sherlock Holmes story, he's going to be the same guy in every story you read. What's a dynamic character? That's somebody who ages, somebody who changes, somebody for whom what happens in one of the books is reflected in the subsequent entries in the series in how that character responds to the world. And so creating aging Cork, aging his children, having them respond to one another differently, having them come of age before the reader's eyes, all of those things have helped keep it interesting for me. But I've also along the way monkeyed with structure. I have begun with the ending, and I have in Thunder Bay, I began in first person, Cork's voice, middle section is third person, Henry Malou's story, come back to Cork's voice, first person at the end. I've done all kinds of things to try to keep it interesting for me as a writer and challenging for me as a writer. And I hope I never put a book out there where readers know exactly what to expect in the story.
When did the idea first hit you with lightning strike to write a prequel to the Cork novels, especially visiting the relationship between Cork and his father Liam O'Connor up close and personal with readers?
Well, this is something my agent has been after me to do for years. Across the whole course of the Cork O'Connor series, I have often made reference to events and individuals in Cork's past who were important in shaping him into the man who occupies center stage in this series. And my agent for years has been saying, this is rich territory, Kent. You need to mine this. And quite honestly, I didn't have another idea. So I thought, oh, what the hell, let's give it a shot. Now, about that point in time, a friend of mine in the Ojibwe community, a guy who's an officer with the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe police, told me about a thing called that I had never known about, a thing called the Relocation Act of 1956. which was a piece of legislation that devastated Native communities across this nation. And so I began thinking about, okay, how can I construct a story that involves this and that will carry on the themes that I try to talk about: racial prejudice, cultural differences, how truth can be different depending upon the cultural perspective from which you view an event, all of that.
Was the most recent book in the series set in the present, Desolation Mountain, the last fans will hear from Old Cork, or can we look forward to his return in new and upcoming books?
For Desolation Mountain, there were two things that came together in the writing of that story. The first was this: many, many years ago, we had one of the finest members of Congress, a man named Paul Wellstone. He was our senator. And toward the end of his campaign for re-election, he was killed in a plane crash in northern Minnesota, about which there, to this day, remain a lot of questions. And his Senate seat was won then by a Republican. He was going to be the shoe-in. Then the Republican candidate ended up winning the election and shifting the power in Congress. And so that was the beginning of my thinking about, conspiracy theory. And at the same point in time, we were continuing in northern Minnesota to deal with the threat to the boundary waters of a heavy metals mine up there, right at the edge of the boundary waters, in a location that could, if there were a problem, significantly destroy the ecosystem up there. And so I brought those two together in a way that, the mind of a writer, particularly a mystery writer, works, and somehow found a way to bind them together.
Cork's got a lot of loyal fans around the world who I'm sure have a lot of ideas for a lot of new books that I'm sure they write you with suggestions for. Has any of their input ever wound up in the stories?
I have seldom, if ever, taken an idea that one of my readers sent to me and said, "Oh, you're going to love this. You should write about this." I have listened to my Ojibwe friends, and I have taken a lead from their suggestions on a number of occasions.
Without giving too much away, can you give fans and viewers a little bit of a look at where Cork's headed in this next book?
I'll have two more Cork O'Connor novels under contract. I have finished the next in the Cork O'Connor series, a book called Fox Creek, that will be out in August. Lightning Strike, the one that came up before this, was the prequel, Cork when he's 12 years old. This one brings Cork back into the present. Cork O'Connor is drawn into a case by a man who is not who he says he is. And when Cork accidentally leads this man and some very evil people to Crow Point, where Henry Malou lives, Henry ends up having to go on the run with Cork's wife and another stranger woman, lead them into the boundary waters, and use all of his wiles to try to stay one step ahead of his relentless pursuers, while Cork, in the meantime, is trying to figure out what the hell is going on. I'm opening my mind to whatever idea I can have for the next Cork O'Connor novel that I'm going to begin on.
A lot of your peers have talked about it really being like looking in a mirror when they sit down with a long-running series character to begin work on a new book. Is that how it feels for you?
Yeah, I pretty much flipped the switch. Cork is right there. He's always there. I just rely on him to say what he ought to say and to behave in the way he ought to behave.
What kind of accent does he talk in as you're writing his dialogue?
Pretty much a flat Minnesota accent.
What about Henry?
Henry speaks in kind of an archaic way. He never uses contractions. Henry, his first language was Anishinaabe, and he really learned English as a result of being in a boarding school, which he ran away from many times. So he speaks an archaic English.
Any chance fans will ever get to see these two on screen together?
Jake, I've been dealing with Hollywood for 20 years with regard to Cork. Don't hold your breath. Let's see. Ordinary Grace, a screenplay is currently being written for Ordinary Grace. It's under contract. And we've been in negotiations with several production companies for the rights to this tender land.
What does it mean to you that this wholly original character and series you invented has become such a permanent part of readers' hearts that it has its own bookshelf or maybe even bookcase in their house? And then, of course, libraries and bookstores all over the world and in so many different translations.
What do I like about the fact that people embrace the sense of place I give them, this homeland, this adopted homeland of mine? Um, I I so love it. Do you know, to many people, Minnesota is an exotic place. They've never been here. They've had no interest in being here. It's part of the great flyover. And so I love that giving them Minnesota in a way that makes them want to pause, to come here and appreciate what it is that makes this place special.
Stepping away from Cork's world for a moment, in light of the equal success of recent books like Ordinary Grace, The River We Remember, The Levee, and Spirits Crossing, where else would you still like to wander on the page with your pen that you haven't yet?
Yeah, I've done two novels set in the Minnesota River Valley of southern Minnesota. I would love to make that a trilogy, come up with, and I've been at work maybe on a story that will do that, will be the third standalone. During the pandemic, I was quite prolific. I wrote two novellas, was told, you can't, there's really not a platform for two novellas. You need to write at least a third so we can put these together. So I have been at work on a third novella. The Levee, the historical markers, and the long and winding road.
After taking home everything from multiple Minnesota Book Awards to Anthony Awards, Barry Awards, the Dilly Awards, the Friends of American Writers Prize, and on, what has it meant to you to see this character and series so roundly acknowledged? I have to imagine being voted in by readers or your own peers is the coolest in a way.
Well, it's a pretty good thing. It's a pretty good feeling to be acknowledged. The Anthony Award is really one that's given by readership. And to know that readers appreciate your work is wonderful. The Edgar Award that I won was given by my peers, and that is also just wonderful to be acknowledged for the quality of your work by your peers. But if you write with an idea that you're going to get awarded for it, you are going to probably be disappointed. If you write with the idea that you're going to make your living in it, you're probably going to be disappointed because those things just don't happen. So when anybody asks me, what's the best piece of advice you can give me, a young writer, I say, write because you love it, not because anything is ever going to come of it,
Still, you made it happen. In closing, what do you say to those who you can see have the dedication and are willing to put the time and work in to try to pursue the kind of career you've had?
In terms of advice to writers, here it is. Write every single day. Stay connected to the energy of your project. It doesn't matter how long you write in a day, you need to do it every single day. And it'll do several things for you. First of all, it will tell everybody who cares about you that this is important to you. It will, as I say, keep you connected to the energy of a project. And maybe even more important, it's confirmation to you of the importance in your life that writing has, the place it has.
Mr. Krueger, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
All right, bye-bye.